Do you remember when at Twin Hearts, the early days when you skied? So we talked about the lifts. Did they basically just have a couple runs, ski runs?
Oh, really? Twin Hearts was really only one run right up
Okay,
down the, although there were other little trails through the woods, but you wanted a more or less continuous slope, you know, hopefully from top to bottom. Like up in Collingwood, you got a steep hill most of the way up the hill. So we were looking for to get the most people up and down. All you really needed was a big open area, which is what Twin Hearts had. That the trees in the middle of that, yes, when you went up the T-bar, you could ski to either side, uh, east or west, left or right. One side was probably better than the other, but I do remember seeing big bulldozers from Green or from Creek Construction in Hamilton, maybe even an earth mover moving large volumes of sand to create those trails. And Doug was kind of the engineer, and it was his place, and he had access to his bulldozers. He never could have done it without the money that came from his father's business. I don't think. That may not being fair to Doug. But the story was, well, Doug's dad had lots of money and bought him hill and said, here, stay out of my way and build a ski hill, Doug.
and you said Doug's dad was it with Greenie Metal Products? That's where he.
He was one of the owners also of Greening Metal Products, and he owned Frid Construction.
Okay, okay. Well, that's going to be my transition question. So they started off with the rope tows, cable tow, and then eventually, you were saying it sounds like when Valley Shush got the pommel lift, then they wanted to do something similar. So they ended up getting a T-bar. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, Doug, to be fair, would have been familiar with skiing in Vermont at that time, and they had T-bars and chairlifts in Vermont at that time. He named Twin Hearts after a lodge in Vermont. It may still be there, called Twin Hearts.
Oh, we did. Okay.
Not far from where your dad and my dad skied at Pico Peaks in Okemo in Vermont.
Now, was Doug from the States, from up that way?
Well, he's from Hamilton. He had
Okay.
several brothers who were, the Frid company in Hamilton was well known as a huge construction company.
Okay. So what are the origins of that T-bar?
Well, okay, we had a pommel lift. Other people had T-bars. There was a company in Watertown, New York called Hall Ski Lift Company that were making dozens of T-bars at that time and selling them all over the place. Eastern North America, Quebec, Ontario. There would have been Hall T-bars on the ground in Quebec, north of Ottawa, Montreal. I don't know whether Hall made the chairlifts that we rode on at Mont Tremblant, or before Valley Shush was conceived of. Anyway, there were T-bars around. Doug knew, well, we just have to spend more money, we'll get a T-bar. We can't let Valley Shush get ahead of us. It was competitive. So we had the pommel lift. Doug got a T-bar. And because my dad he was a mining engineer, he knew about big machines and cable and all that stuff. I'm pretty sure Doug would have said to Dad, okay, how about a T-bar? Doug and Dad knew each other at this point. We had a pommel lift. I can see them sitting over a coffee and saying, well, Lloyd, why don't you and Greening Metal Products build a T-bar and we'll put it on Doug Frid's hill? Sure enough, it happened. Something like that.
So what was Doug's age relative to you? Was
Relative to Dad, he was maybe 10 years younger than Dad. He's a lot older than I.
Okay.
He wasn't an old man when I met him, but
right.
30 or 40 like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could see how he would have that relationship with your dad.
Oh, yeah. Everybody had a relationship with Dad. It was hard not to do that because he was gregarious and easy to talk to and knew a lot.
Okay. So when they decided to go with the T-bar instead of buying a whole T-bar, they decided, probably with your dad's help and ideas, to build a T-bar at Greening Metal Products?
Well, that I would think was probably because Doug's father was a major shareholder in Greening Metal Products.
But is that true? That T-bar was made at Greening Metal Products?
Oh, absolutely. It was made in Orangeville.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, I helped to put it up. Doug had other laborers, and we had Valley Shift at that time, so that was consuming my time. But I watched it go up, and the bottom terminal was different than many other ski hills. The tensioning device, the big counterweight that you had to have to keep the cable a certain tension on it, was not at the top of the hill, it was at the bottom. And that big plate structure there was this long, huge, very, very substantial building that had a long set of tracks, like a train track overhead, on which sat the machine room, the big electric motor, the gear reducer, the bow wheel, and that was tensioned. That whole thing was tensioned by a giant counterweight at the downhill end of it.
so you think this right here is the concrete that was the bottom of the T-bar, that tensioning system?
Well, it's not the concrete, it's the building that went over it. It was all housed, it was covered.
Okay.
So that's probably the building. And if you were to take the roof off, you'd see all the stuff that Valley just ended up inheriting years later.
Well, that was going to be my follow-on question, but do you remember what year they put that T-bar in?
I couldn't tell you exactly, but it wasn't very long after, 1960 when we installed ours. I don't think it would have been 1961, but probably no later than 1962, because I mean, again, Doug, he wanted a T-bar. He had this more or less Greening Metal Products at his disposal, and by then, Dad was working at Greening Metal Products.
Okay.
Well, did Dad move there immediately? I'm not sure when he started there, but he was an engineer. He was working for them selling other stuff, but he and the team there were quite capable of just looking at all the ski lifts in the countryside and saying, well, we'll do this and this and this. We can build a T-bar, no problem. Mines and all sorts of other industries had similar kinds of machinery. It was not rocket science.
Right. All right. So this, let me see if we got any more. At any time, did they have snowmaking there, or was it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Not
Okay.
initially. Again, after those first 3 winters with virtually no snow, everybody said, well, they're making snow down there in Vermont. Let's make snow. John Clifford of Chelsea, Quebec, near Ottawa, sold Doug, I'm pretty sure, some big, huge water snow guns. We had something else, didn't use the compressed air, but I remember being on Doug's hill probably in 64 or 5, listening to this incredibly noisy snow gun. It was just impossible to be anywhere near it if you didn't have your ears really protected off on his hill. And again, at Hockley Valley Ski Club, Benny Friedhoff had the first snowmaker I had ever seen. I think he just rented it for a few days or something or other, but you had to get a compressor and whatever. Anyway, it was the thing to do. You got a T-bar and some snowmaking and maybe a chairlift eventually, and on and on.
Do you, would you have any idea where they got their water source from?
Twin Hearth? Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
pump house is right out there on the river. It's just off your picture, but straight from the chalet down this steep hill under the road to the river. Like there's a bend in the river there on the north side of the road. Yeah, I went right from that black line. I'm not sure why that's there, but anyway, straight down the hill. That hill was really steep, but again, Frid Construction could do that sort of thing. And there's a pump house on the river. The remains of it are probably still there. Big pump in there. The electricity had already come down the Hockley Road, 3-phase, and that's what we used. If it hadn't been for the electricity, things would have been very different in that business.
So where my cursor at, is this where you're talking about for the pump house?
No, you were on it before. You go across the road. See the Hockley Road where it bends?
Oh, over here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right there. You're on the site of the pump house, right there. Well, just cross the road, and the river is right there.
Okay.
The river is closest to the road. It's only like 100 feet from the river to the road.
Okay.
Right there, up to the top of the hill, and then over to the T-bar and up the hill. It was really easy to get water. I mean, it's steep as heck, but electricity pumps water anywhere.
Yeah. So when you say compressed air, did they have like a big, what kind of, how did they get
Okay, early on, most people would rent a great big air compressor on wheels, the type that construction companies use to drill rock and all sorts of things. It's a big four-wheel wagon with a great big diesel engine on it and an air compressor hooked up to it. You can still see smaller versions or bigger all over the place. A lot of companies just haul this two-wheeled compressor over to, sandblast or whatever. So they were quite available. And again, if you want to read something, it might be worth looking at. There's a book called Black Gold, written by this John Clifford I mentioned, who sold for Larchmont in Canada a lot of snowmaking equipment at that time. And he did that and other things, sold ski lifts as well, and started ski hills and on. John was a real whirlwind. I actually knew him. And he wrote this book called Black Gold about the snowmaking business. He sold air water. We didn't have the air involved in our snowmaking. That's another story. But it was a competitive business, of course.
Yeah. So those snow guns were the ones that basically sat fairly close to the ground, and it was just simply the air came in, water came in.
You could make one in a minute here in your shop. It's just a pipe with a T just before a nozzle. The straight through pipe usually carried air, I guess, and the one that came from the side, water. In any case, you mix the water and air just before the nozzle, where it shoot out and the air would, they called it atomizing, would break that water up into fine particles. It's like blowing your mouth full of water in the wintertime out. You could probably see snow if you did that at the right temperature. So this is just a big version of that. There are all sorts of variations on it, but basically a little tripod, about 2 feet above the ground, with this gun on it. Some systems had dozens of these guns, probably hundreds of them, all over the hill. Then they got, well, let's get it higher up. And, the whole thing changed a lot. But for years, there were all these little snow guns. You could carry one of them, even when it was running. If you didn't want it to knock you over, you had to be careful, but you could do it.
So back then, Twin Hearts had snowmaking before Valley Shush then, using that compressed air.
Don't know that. I don't know that.
Okay.
It would have been contemporaneous, probably roughly the same time.
I wonder if your dad ever tried selling them any SMI stuff.
Oh, Dad tried selling everybody SMI stuff. That was his business.
Yeah.
He sold it.
Yep.
And at that time, super competitive. Oh, the air water is better for this and that, and the airless is better. Super competitive.
I could imagine.
Go on and on about that.
Yeah. But I could definitely see the limitations of having that, that compressor. That certainly would,
Yeah. To be fair, some elements of the systems were simpler, like the fans on the SMI stuff was a super expensive thing. But again, the efficiency, people claimed all sorts of things for both types of equipment. I'll never know which was true. They all just were trying to one up the others.
So do you remember when the ski resort ended? Twin Hearts?
Twin Hearth, Aspen. Ooh, well, it was before the demise of the chalet at Valley Shush for sure, which was what, 1970?
80. Yep.
So that T-bar went in a few years before that, let's say late 70s, mid to late 70s. So that's when Twin Hearts folded. Dad negotiated a deal where, of course, he had helped design the T-bar. He said, okay, Doug, we'll take the T-bar off your hands and your little grooming machine, your Bombi, and the cable tow. That's where the motor that's in my shop is still sitting. He bought them all. And that was on behalf of Valley Shush, and then just moved them over to Valley Shush.
So Doug basically just came to the rationalization that he just couldn't, it just wasn't feasible to run a ski resort anymore, and just kind of gave up. And
to be fair, most ski resorts never made money. The big ones did, but it's not a great business proposition. It's very sexy and people love it, and they have fun in the chalet and on and on and on. So I doubt if he ever made an awful lot of money. Certainly not enough to justify calling it a year-round business, because this was a very short season.
Right.
Unpredictable, even with snowmaking, you couldn't really tell, because if there was no snow in Toronto, no skiers in the valley.
So where did this T-bar end up at Valley Shush?
Where?
Yeah, so when your dad bought it from Twin Hearts, you said it ended up at Valley Shush.
Well, yeah, we moved it to this area where we knew for years was where we would put another lift if we could afford to buy one.
Was that what we're calling the third T-bar?
Yeah.
Okay.